Oh yeah, spoiler alert. Hello Internet, I'm Frank Baldwin aka Sandy Brushtail and welcome to another episode of Furry Fandom Stories. For this episode I'm going to be continuing my analysis of Art Spiegelman's Mouse. But before we can go into Book 2, just a quick recap of Book 1. You're not getting one, just watch my other video. So we ended Book 1 with Vladek and his wife Anya trying to escape Poland. However, the man who said they could smuggle them into Hungary turned out to be an informant for the Gestapo. The main key point to remember is that when the Spiegelmans were sent from Bielsko to Auschwitz, they were sent there not as ordinary Jews, but as criminals. The second book of Mouse, entitled And Here My Troubles Began, is Vladek's account of what happened to him after arriving in Auschwitz. Seeing as he was separated from his wife Anya, the second book would mainly cover Vladek's view of events. The first chapter of the book, entitled Mauschwitz, begins with Art and his wife holidaying in Vermont, but Vladek rings them up, insisting that they come to his retirement bungalow in the Catskills. Once there, Vladek would recall more of his time he spent in Auschwitz, after being sent to the Buchenwald barracks of the camp. Vladek would begin with recalling what happened when he was first processed when he was arrived, as he and other prisoners were forced to take a freezing cold shower and afterwards were forced to run naked through snow as their camp uniforms were tossed to him. Vladek would also recall incidents involving prisoners and guards. For example, when one prisoner complained that his shoes didn't fit him properly, the guard took them off him and then beat him around the head with them. Vladek would also recall an incident where a guard snatched the uniform cap off an inmate and tossed it into the barbed wire, ordering him to go get it. When his prisoner crossed the fence line, he was then cut down with machine gun fire. Vladek would also recount the uneasy alliance he was starting to establish between himself and the camp's capos. The second chapter of Book 2, entitled Auschwitz Time Flies, begins with Art Spiegelman recalling the unexpected success he experienced after the first book of Mouse was released. After being hounded by the press, Art Spiegelman goes to visit his therapist, where they sit down and discuss why Art wanted to do Mouse as a project, and if listening to his father's old conversations was starting to make him feel uncomfortable. However, the story is back in Auschwitz-Birkenau, as Vladek recalls more of the time he spent there. Some events that stood out were Vladek meeting a German Jew who had a son who was serving in the German army, and seeing his wife Anya again after being assigned to repair some of the barrack buildings in the women's section. It's also the chapter where Vladek explains how the gas chamber of the crematorium works. He thought it was just a rumour until he started talking to somebody who was on body disposal detail, and then he saw it with his own eyes. The third chapter, Here My Troubles Began, recounts what happened at Auschwitz-Birkenau towards the ending months of the war. By 1945, the Reich was fighting a losing war, with a unified Allied force crossing the Ruhr and Rhine rivers, and a Red Army crossing the Polish border and now sweeping across Eastern Europe. At the start of the chapter, Vladek recalls being able to hear the booms of the Russian artillery. Faint at first, but as the weeks draw on, get louder and louder as the Red Army begins its advance. Fearing that the camp will be discovered, the SS clear Auschwitz-Birkenau of all prisoners and make plans to burn it to the ground. The prisoners were then sent on a death march from Auschwitz to Gross-Rosen, over 100 miles away. Many prisoners suffering from malnutrition and the winter cold would not reach there. Whilst at Gross-Rosen, the prisoners were then loaded onto trains and would be transferred to other camps around Germany. It's here that Vladek discovers that his train is bound for Dachau. He also describes the various health hazards that he and the other prisoners suffered, including an infestation of lice and a typhus outbreak in the barracks at Dachau. Soon after Vladek had arrived, American troops were beginning to advance into the area surrounding the camp, and prisoners fit enough for travel were then boarded onto a train bound for Switzerland, told that they would be exchanged for German POWs. The penultimate chapter, Saved, begins with Vladek and his other prisoners hearing news that the Red Army has advanced on Berlin, and they assume that the war is over. However, this doesn't mean that Vladek and the other prisoners are in the clear just yet. Vladek and the other prisoners are then taken from the train and then marched through a wood where they stop at a lake, where they are told to wait. Some of the prisoners take this opportunity to make a run for it, seeing as some of their guards had deserted after hearing the news from Berlin. Vladek and another prisoner take the opportunity to make a run for it, and they decide to lay low in a barn. When the barn's owner discovers them, he tries to turn them into German soldiers, to which they just say, "We don't care," and just drive on. After finding a change of clothes, Vladek and his friend escape the barn, where they run into a squad of American soldiers who give them sanctuary. As the days go by, Vladek is treated fairly by the American soldiers. He even offers to help them keep their uniforms clean. He had become such a big help to the American soldiers that they affectionately nickname him Willie. And when the farmer he borrowed the clothes from shows up demanding them back, the American soldiers act as moderators. The story then takes a break to a narrative to a scene where old Vladek finds a shoebox full of old family photos. Art then realises all of the photos are from his mother's side of the family, seeing as Vladek fell out of contact with the members of his close family after the war. The final chapter of Mouse is entitled The Second Honeymoon, where we see Vladek round up his survival story and how he got reunited with his wife. The chapter opens with Art trying to continue his work on Mouse, but is interrupted by a phone call from his stepmom in Florida. His father was admitted to hospital after getting fluid in his lungs. He semi-recovered, but he discharged himself before his doctors could give him the all clear. Acting with a stubbornness that only old age can bring, old Vladek insists that he be treated at a hospital in New York, seeing as he was more familiar with the doctors there. When Art and his wife Francoise are helping Vladek pack for his trip back to New York, old Vladek then recounts why he wanted to leave Poland after the war. When the war ended, throngs of refugees were displaced, trying to pick up the pieces of the lives before the war or thinking about starting anew somewhere else. Still in Germany, Vladek tried to find out what had happened to his wife. And whilst riding through the country on a freight train he had snuck aboard, Vladek saw what was left of the German towns. He even mentioned feeling smug in a way. Germany was in ruins, and he couldn't help but think this is what her people deserved after what they had done to the Jews. Vladek then finds himself in Hanover, which is under British jurisdiction, and there he meets a couple he recognises from Sosnowiec. They tell Vladek not to return to Sosnowiec after they hear that a friend tried to go home and then found out that his house had been given to Polish nationals. Vladek, however, is given good news for a change. Anya is alive. Vladek manages to get a photo of himself and sends it to the Jewish organisations who were set up to help displaced Jews, and it gets into circulation. After arriving back in Sosnowiec, Vladek finds a Jewish organisation and passes on his information. And soon enough, Vladek is reunited with his wife, and the story ends. And that's the story of Mouse. For the rest of this video, I'm going to be going over some of the main themes of the book, what Art Spiegelman actually thought about his work, and finally, my own thoughts. When it comes to historical accuracy, you can tell that Art Spiegelman did a lot of research when he was writing Mouse. During the conversations he would have with his father, Art Spiegelman would ask how certain events took place. For example, when the prisoners of Auschwitz-Birkenau were sent on the death march to Gross-Rosen, Art Spiegelman would ask, did the guards walk in front of them? Did they walk beside them? Or behind them? Or all three? Would the prisoners be told to march upright, or did they march slumped? When it comes to historical inaccuracies, they're quite minor and don't really spoil anything. The biggest ones were when the fascists actually hung undesirables in Sosnowiec, they didn't hang them from gallows. Instead, they hung them from trees. The second biggest inaccuracy is when the Jews of Sosnowiec were told to assemble in a sports ground. You see, when Art Spiegelman was drawing Mouse, he envisioned this grand stadium with stands and seating arrangements and changing rooms. However, when Art Spiegelman actually took a trip to Poland in the 1980s to visit some of the places he mentions in his book, this is what the sports ground actually looked like. Spiegelman himself has gone on to say that the feelings he had towards his own work are reflected in Mouse. On page 174, the last 4 panels actually describe the kind of relationship that Art had with his father. Depressed again? Just thinking about my book. It's so presumptuous of me. I mean, I can't even make any sense out of my relationship with my father. How am I supposed to make any sense out of Auschwitz, of the Holocaust? When I was a kid, I used to think about which of my parents I let the Nazis take to the ovens if I could save only one of them. Usually I save my mother. Do you think that's normal? Nobody's normal. As for how he felt about drawing the comic, this is page 176. I never felt guilty about Rishu, but I did have nightmares about SS men coming into my class and dragging all us Jewish kids away. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't obsessed with this stuff. It's just that sometimes I'd fantasize Zyklon B coming out of the shower instead of water. I know this is insane, but I somehow wish I had been in Auschwitz with my parents, so I could really know what they lived through. I guess it's some kind of guilt about having had an easier life than they did. I feel so inadequate trying to reconstruct a reality that was worse than my darkest dreams. I'm trying to do it as a comic strip? I guess I bit off more than I can chew. Maybe I ought to forget the whole thing. There's so much I'll never be able to understand or visualize. I mean, reality is too complex for comics. So much has to be left out or distorted. Just keep it honest, honey. See what I mean? In real life, you never have let me talk this long without interrupting. Light me a cigarette. There's also an instance in Mouse where Art calls out his father's casual racism. In an interview he did for the University of Washington at Seattle, he said this.
But anything else would have been real lying. I mean, I was interested in locating a truth. I wasn't interested in creating a myth. So that required, I guess it could be called warts and all. It just meant not ennobling things beyond their actualities. So that meant like trying to report on what my relationship with my father was like, and what he was like, and that's not to say, and here's this noble guy who survived the horrors of the world, all the horrors the world could offer up, and look how saintly he's become. I mean, that would have been just some kind of twisted, to me, very obscene work.
After the success of Mouse, Art Spiegelman went on to be a cover illustrator for the New Yorker magazine. He and his wife Francoise came up with the concept of the black-on-black Twin Towers cover, which was made for the first release of the magazine after the 9/11 terror attacks. After 2001, Spiegelman left the New Yorker magazine and instead became a freelance artist and also wrote thought columns for numerous publications, including the Jewish Daily Forward and Harper's Magazine. In 2010, Art Spiegelman was made editor of Lynn Ward's 6 novels in woodcuts, and in 2011 made a companion to Mouse entitled Meta Mouse. I'd first read Mouse back in 2011 when I was attending my cousin's wedding, and his fiancée had borrowed Mouse from their local library. Now, I had read autobiographical comics before, but I had never read one about the Holocaust. Seeing as it used anthropomorphic characters to tell its story, it immediately grabbed my attention. And it's also an account of one of the darkest chapters in human history. To be honest, I wasn't really a fan of the whole black and white minimalist art style, but I have a feeling that was more to do with how the comic was printed more than anything else. But then again, I read Persepolis, that was in black and white, and I really liked that comic. Just like how George Orwell tried to tell the story of the Russian Revolution in a way everybody can understand, Mouse tells the story of the Holocaust in a way everybody can understand. It's grim, thought-provoking, and pulls no punches. However, it's also gripping, and some parts of it are heartwarming and caring. It's an autobiography, biography, and history all crammed into one book. It's also a reminder of that human beings can and certainly will commit what we call crimes against humanity. We keep repeating to ourselves this mantra of never again, but the big picture is we've been doing this to ourselves again and again since the Holocaust. Granted, not on the massive scale, but the principles are the same. I don't think I can put this point across more bluntly. Read this book. And also, there's something else I would like to say. The reason why it took me so long to do these videos is because when you talk about anything with a subject matter like the Holocaust, you have to approach it very carefully, which is why I haven't been signing off my videos in my usual way. When I was actually doing some deeper research into the Holocaust, when you take the preliminary 6 million Jews that died and then add on the death toll of all the other groups who perished in the Holocaust, the final death toll rises from 6 million to 11 million. That's terrifying! And that was Mouse by Art Spiegelman, an anthropomorphic graphic novel that I think furries should be more familiar with. Now, the next graphic novel we're going to look at on Furry Fandom Stories, we're going to change genre. We're going to be moving on from gritty historical drama to steampunk fantasy alternate history. And that wraps up another episode of Furry Fandom Stories. Again, if you like the show, please feel free to like, share and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at SandyBFox. Use the hashtag Furry Fandom Stories. I'm Frank Baldwin, aka Sandy Brushtail, and I will see you again on Furry Fandom Stories. Take care. What? I know I don't have anything on my face!